and a very warm welcome to everyone here today. One of the key factors in deciding the school for our little one is choosing what curriculum you want your child to read. As a first-time parent, trying to understand curriculums can be very daunting. It was certainly for me. And typically, when we are dealing with something that we don't understand, our approach usually is to not consider it. With the international curriculum gaining so much popularity lately, we decided to spend today's session discussing and understanding the importance of international curriculum, especially in primary years. My name is Pooja, Kedia, and I'm from SchoolWiser. And today's discussion is about trying to help our parents understand the international curriculum better and try and understand what is the best time to start international curriculum. And for this, we are joined today by an expert panel who collectively have almost 8 decades of experience in education. Please join me in welcoming the first panelist for today, Mrs. Paramjeet Karnaran. Mrs. Narang has lived a nomadic life and experienced more than 14 cities in India. She has over 50 years of rich experience in schools such as Loreto Convent Ranchi, City Montessori Lucknow, Little Flower Ahmedabad, St. Michael's Patna, Mothers International, Vasant Valley, and Bluebells Delhi, and many more. Mrs. Narang, in her last school stint, was the director at the Pathways International School, Gurgaon, and was instrumental in establishing all 3 IB programs. Post-retirement, Mrs. Narang has chosen to spread her wisdom by consulting with various schools. She's also a part of Hum Sarthi, an initiative of FICCI Arise to promote partnership of private schools with government schools, along with doing some voluntary work. Welcome, Mrs. Narang, and thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to us today.
Thank you, Pooja.
Our second panelist for today is Mr. Vishnu Karthik. Vishnu has over 15 years of experience in leadership development, school leadership, and school administration. An alum of the Harvard University, he has been responsible for new school initiatives and strategic projects for the Heritage Group, including curriculum development, instructional leadership, continuous school improvement, and technology integration. Vishnu has delivered projects in India, US, Southeast Asia, and Europe. He is a practitioner of yoga and Vedanta and believes that his work is a medium to reach his deeper self. Vishnu is currently the CEO of Xperiential Learning Systems and the director of the Heritage Group of Schools. A very warm welcome to you, Vishnu, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
We also have with us Ms. Jyothis Mathew. Ms. Mathew is currently serving as the principal and the head of school of Treamis International, Bangalore. She is a visionary leader with an excellent track record in education management, curriculum design, and implementation. Ms. Matthews has an extensive experience in setting up and heading schools with IB, IGCSE, and CBSE curriculum, including creating effective learning environments, school management systems, and staffing and curriculum development. She is passionate as an educator and has volunteered a lot of training and development sessions on how children learn, approaches to teaching and learning, collaborative teaching, learning, inclusive education, and whole school development. Before her venture into K-12 school space, she was associated with education management at the university level. Welcome, Ms. Matthews, and thank you for your presence here today.
Thank you, Ms. Pooja.
All right. Vishnu, if I may, I'd like to start today's discussion with you. And my question for you is going to be in 2 parts. The first part is for those parents who are going to be watching this video who don't really understand the international curriculum. So if you could very briefly help our parents understand the key factors that differentiate the international curriculum from the national curriculum, that'll be really handy. And then dive deep and help us understand what are the key highlights for our parents that they need to keep in mind when they're starting up with international curriculum to be able to, especially in primary years, to be able to maximize benefits that they can deliver from the international curriculum.
So Pooja, I'm going to answer the first part of the question first, which is around what's the key differences for a layman between an international curriculum and the national curriculums. International curriculum, I would imagine you're referring to the Cambridge, IB, advanced AP, which is the US, for example, or IPYC, IYC, for example. There are several options available. As against the national curriculum, which also includes the CBSE, ICSE, and let's not forget the state boards, which is still the largest schooling system in the country today. So there are 4 key differences I would see from an eyes of a parent for it to simply understand in these two. One is a national curriculum is largely a chapter-focused curriculum. So it's a box curriculum. There are chapters one after another, as against an international curriculum, which is more a concept-focused curriculum. The focus is on concepts and themes, and there are projects around it to do it. So chapter focus versus concept focus. Second is the assessment is largely in the national curriculum is around content, about recall, about knowing things, as against in the international curriculum where the assessment is largely around application, skills, as against knowing or memorizing things, right? So that's a key difference. Assessment is, in fact, the proof of pudding. One way to differentiate as curriculum is the way how they assess, because what gets measured gets done eventually. So one of the good ways to compare curriculums is to say, how do they do assessments? So here assessment is largely around content, whereas in international, largely it's around concepts, skills, and applications. The third key difference I see between national and international curriculum is in the national curriculums, the focus is largely on a final examination. It's more summative in nature. Of course, there are internal, there are projects, but largely the assessment is around the final summative exam. But the international, the assessment is all through the year. There are periodic milestones, there are internal assessments, and your final assessment is not just based on one summative exam, but a lot of formatives through the year. And finally, which is the most important difference for me between a national and international curriculum, is that in the national curriculum, largely, it is more teacher-led. Teacher is the primary agent of leading that learning process forward, as against international curriculums where the idea is largely student-led. The agency is with the student with a certain voice and choice on how to learn and how to express one's understanding. Of course, these are broad stereotypes. There are schools within each of these systems which do exceptionally well. There are national curriculum schools which do really well. And there are also international schools which probably teach the national curriculum way. So, but these are broad, easy ways to differentiate between these two curriculums.
Great, thank you so much for that. That's beautifully summed up. I think those are pointers that parents kind of watching this video should sit with the pen and paper. So we've said that international curriculum is concept-led. It's based on concepts. It's more application and skill-based. It's kind of measured and looked at all through the year vis-a-vis just some key exams that happen at a periodic time. And it is more student-focused. Thank you so much for that, Vishnu. Vishnu, my second part of the question was for you to help, for you to highlight for our parents the importance of starting the international curriculum early to maximize the benefits, rather than probably going up to a grade 10th and then choosing international curriculum as something that you want your child to do.
Yeah. So
Pooja, may I interrupt, Vishnu? Please,
Sure.
May I take the liberty of interrupting over here? May I give you just one very specific example to elucidate everything that Vishnu has said, because a practical learning. So supposing in the primary school, food is one of the topics that is dealt with children because we want them to make the right choices. So the concept over here is, what is healthy food?
Mm-hmm.
And instead of giving them the information of what is healthy food, you give them the experience. You take a potato, you take a slice of potato and you take potato chips and you keep them out for the child to observe, and let the child observe and document through photographs, through drawings, or whatever ways, observe what is happening over there. And at the end of it, then the child asks the questions. You want the child to be curious. Why did this become moldy? Why is this still the way it was started out? What are the changes that have happened? And that is the time for them to research and find out more. And research can be very simple. At this point of time, they could go to books, they could go to the internet, but even asking their parents or the elders or their friends or even their cook why this is happening. And then having understood the whole process of what processed food is and what harm it can do, then what choices would they make? You give them options. These are the food things, which would you choose? And then having learned it in one context, if they are able to transfer it, the assessment comes in the choices that they make and the transference of that learning to other choices, related choices that they make.
Great,
So
thank you so much for that. Thank you for that example. And I love what you said. So there is, in fact, that's something that I want to come to later, which is, how does that link up to experiential learning? And Vishnu, that's something that I specifically want to ask you because you're associated with us with a school that, talks about experiential learning a lot, and I'm sure does that beautifully as well. So I'll go back to you, Vishnu, with the second part of my question. Help us understand, the why start early.
Yeah, so in our own experience, we run several CBSE campuses and also campuses with international curriculum. And often we see parents shifting from CBSE to international because it is getting more and more popular. There's a larger acceptance and recognition of the quality of the learning experience. But we also see that when children join the international curriculum from a traditional national curriculum setup, they do find it difficult or takes time to do the transition. So often we tell parents that, hey, if you want to shift to an international curriculum, shift early on. So often parents say that, hey, I want to shift maybe in 11 and 12 or 9 and 10. Our response is that, isn't that too late? Because some of the foundational skills and capacities are built in the primary years and middle years. Like Mrs. Narang would just share, the idea of food is very, very powerful. Now, imagine a child going through this example of understanding about food, which is a critical life concept early on in life, as against, memorizing the idea of food and coming to international 11 and 12, it just doesn't make sense. So our recommendation is shift early if it's possible, at least because the primary and middle years are the foundation. In some sense, forgive me for taking an extreme stand, but I'm just trying to provocate parents thinking. My view is that, a strong primary and middle years is more than enough for a child to live a healthy life. In fact, this college and all is absolutely unnecessary if the child is truly gifted. They can figure out their lives. They'll probably create a startup. They'll do some civic leadership work. They'll create meaning in society as long as the primary and middle years are taken care of. So the primary objective as parents or as educators is to ensure those foundation years are taken care of. And yes, moving into an international curriculum, experiencing learning the way Ms. Narang just pointed out is far more beneficial if you do it in your younger years.
Great, thank you so much. And I like what you said about the fact that their foundation skills need to be built. And I love what you said about the fact that after probably, the initial years when that foundation is strong and laid, they can literally go and do whatever they want to, which is what we've seen in real life, starting from people like, Steve Jobs and so many successful entrepreneurs who actually not even completed school. So I absolutely second that. In fact, my second question, Mrs. Narang, which is for you, is linked to that. We've seen a normal chatter amongst our parent audience. Typically, parents start considering international education seriously when they think, oh, a bachche ko college ke liye bahar bhejna hai. So that's the starting point. And then this kind of think back that, all right, if my child needs to go and study abroad, we kind of give them a smooth transition or a basis. Help us understand if this thought process that the parents hold, is there any truth in that? Does it really ease out the further studies, or is it not, it's more of a facade?
The way international education, if we are looking at the last 2 years, you're talking of the diploma program or the final 2 years of international curriculum, they are a lot about critical thinking and research skills and arriving at conclusions independently, taking charge of your own learning, which are skills which are very important for education at the tertiary level. These are skills which I'm not saying that national curriculum or CBSE can't develop those skills. In fact, that is their aim. In fact, if you read the new education policy, that is exactly what the new education policy is trying to do. But somehow it is such a mammoth, and they have so much of a backlog, such a big gap that they are really struggling with it. Whereas the international curricula have all the requirements in place. You see, this requires a change of mindset in the teachers. From being the sage on the stage, they have to become the guide on the side. So they have to take away their primacy and give the primacy to the student. And that requires a lot of training, because it's in concept, you can accept it, but it requires a lot of skill. If I go back to the example that I gave, the whole example of planning that experience from start to finish without the teacher coming into the forefront and letting the students do everything and learn, it's a very skillful job, which requires the international curricula have their, all their processes for teacher training in place. A lot of schools are now building even on what is the mandatory training required by any of the international curricula. They are developing their own teacher training programs and building on that to strengthen the programs. So that is what helps really. If you, as Vishnu said, the sooner you start, the better it is. हम लोग सब CBSE के पढ़े हुए हैं. We have also done very well because we were driven. We were driven to go beyond the limitations and beyond boundaries. Students who are driven like that will achieve wherever they are.
Great. So
it
what I hear,
but it will be that much harder for them.
Absolutely. And I think competition is only going up. So what I hear you say is, well, if your child is in grade 8, you've already kind of missed the bus. So you missed those foundation years. So yes, you can't go back and start obviously from scratch, but helping your child in grade 10th and 11th, probably switching to an international board does help, because it helps your child get ready for that research mindset, for that change education mindset. So absolutely, if you've already missed the bus, do consider that. However, if you are a parent whose child is still little, and if you do have aspirations for your child to study abroad, please start early rather than starting late. Great. Thank you so much for that, Mrs. Narang. Thank you so much for listening in very patiently. Jyothis, I'm going to come to you now with my next question. We've already kind of touched upon it. Vishnu mentioned, and Mrs. Narang also mentioned, there is always a phase or a period of transition that happens when a child switches from a national board to an international board. Help our parents understand, do you see students struggle with this change, especially in primary years? Because they're still at a stage where they're very moldable. So let's say if a parent has a child who's in grade 1 or KG and they're now deciding to switch, will the child kind of feel a bit left out and feel a bit awkward in an international classroom vis-a-vis a national classroom at that age? You're on mute. You are still on mute. Okay.
I think I'm.
Yes, you're.
Am I audible now?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, you are.
Yeah, sorry for that technical glitch. So I do represent an institution, wherein we have schools offering CBSE curriculum as well as schools offering international curriculum. So this particular switch, whether it is from the national curriculum to the international curricula or vice versa, it has its own inherent challenges. So when the switch happens from the national curriculum to an international curricula, what we should keep in our mind is that the child is switching from a content-focused, exam-oriented curriculum with predefined textbooks and a prescribed syllabus which has to be completed within a stipulated time frame in the academic year, to a concept-driven curriculum which goes much, much beyond the exams and prepares the child for the 21st century skills. It may or may not have predefined textbooks and prescribed syllabus. So the major challenge would be in the mindset. We need to actually train the parents and the children, to adapt to the new learning environment, which is much more focused on concept-based learning and analytical and reflective thinking. Now, both the fellow panelists have explained about the difference in the assessment modes and objectives. That also varies in national curriculum and international curriculum. In national board, it's mostly exam oriented and the assessment schedule is shared well in advance. Whereas in the international curriculum, it's a continuous assessment which happens throughout. It can happen any day, anytime, in any form. And it gives very clear learner goals to our children.
Which is great, Jyothis, but I'm going to bring you back to, the focus is we're trying to understand for the parents who are looking at admission now for their little ones.
Right.
I don't think they're really worried about the exams and all of that at this stage. So for a little one, for a child who's just about in the age group of anything about 4 to 7 years old, do you think that switch is something that hits the child or the parent? I'm sure there is a lot of parents
It
watching
would
at
switch.
lessons via
I
the
was coming to that point because, the
All right.
children who have been already in this particular international curricula, they are so adjusted to their personal goals, their subject specific goals, and the international curriculum related goals. When I say personal goals, IB plays, or the curriculum that we follow here is IBPYP in the primary year program, it plays a significant role in molding them as global citizens. They give personal goals to children, and they've been already in the system for quite some time, right? And when it comes to subject specific goals, we continuously check whether they have the age appropriate skills and knowledge that is required at that point of time. And also the international curriculum specific goals, which is more to do with the international mindedness. So that can be a major challenge for children, who are joining from the national curriculum to the international curriculum. And to parents, obviously, the international curriculum needs, and it demands more parent involvement and intervention, because the primary year program in international curriculum is more research based. So but at the same time, children do cope up beautifully. The researchers studies shows that your children in the primary years are highly adaptable, and this kind of transition conflict may not last more than 2 to 3 months. So they adapt beautifully, but at the same time there can be hiccups in the beginning.
Great. So what I hear you say is, like any change, yes, there is a transition period. That transition period isn't very tough if that change happens early on in a child's life. There is a little bit of coaching that's required at the parent front, because typically we are the ones who get more stuck up than the children. And what you're essentially saying is 2 to 3 months is the maximum that a parent should keep in mind during this transition, when the child needs a little bit of hand-holding and support. Great, thank you so much for that. Vishnu, I'd like to come back to you now. We kind of touched upon the fact that there is experiential learning that does help and support the delivery of international curriculum. So we've heard a lot of people say that is true, that the experiential learning pedagogy or methodology is quite critical to the successful delivery of international curriculum. Can you briefly tell us how?
So learning is, if your question is around the role of experiential learning in the learning process itself, there's a lot of cognitive psychology research, cognitive neuroscience research about how the brain learns and how humans learn. And our brain is not just something here where, you see content and just gets absorbed. Our brain is all over the body. Our entire nervous system, in some sense, is the brain. In fact, there are brain neurons in different parts of the body, in fact. And learning is not just a head thing, it's a heart, it's a mind, it's the body at all levels. There should be an immersion. Also, learning is very contextual. It's not that I have to learn something in abstract, some piece of information, but it should also be important why that piece of information is important to me. What is the relevance I have to that piece of information? What am I going to do with that piece of information going forward? So that's, you should have some level of engagement or a purpose of learning in itself. So an experiential learning as a pedagogy brings all these things together. It creates an authentic sense of purpose. It focuses on, why am I learning this? Third, it also just doesn't help you learn just in silos like a science, math, English, but in a good experience or a project-based learning pedagogy is interdisciplinary. So you try to solve a problem as against trying to learn science, math, English in silos, because that's the way life is. Life is integrated. It is not divided into subjects or disciplines. So an experiential learning is also around integrated projects. Fourth, most of the project will have an authentic audience, which means that I'm not putting a project on Nile River, on Amazon forest, or the Egyptian civilization just for it to be graded by my teacher in the staff room and that gets locked up in the teacher's cupboard. No, a good project-based learning pedagogy would mean that you're doing a project to solve a real life problem in the community. And there's an authentic audience who's going to use the work of your project. So, for example, I'm just taking on Mrs. Narang's example of food in itself. A good project-based learning or experiential learning pedagogy would be around, let's say, defining the menu for your school's cafeteria. Right? It is food, but the students are not learning about food because they have to master a science chapter on food and nutrition. They are mastering because they want to solve a problem, which is to design a healthy, nutritious cafeteria menu. And there's an authentic audience. The audience is the school students, the school teachers, who's going to give immediate feedback to those students. Hey, this is good or not good. And fourth, which is a very powerful tool in the experiential learning pedagogy, is access to real life practitioners and experts. One of the problems is that textbook-based sage on the stage in teaching, the teacher is the one who's the conduit for all learning. But in a project-based learning, the project is the conduit and the teacher facilitates by bringing in experts to talk to the students. The students also learn from different kinds of people, like a nutritionist, for example, or organic farmer, for example, or a chef, for example, understanding from their perspective, how do they look at food and nutrition? Or maybe even a homemaker for that matter, what are the challenge of actually creating a menu for 6-year-olds and what do they eat, what do they don't eat, for example. So these are some of the powerful things. And come to think of it, that's how we learn in our adult life. In adult life, there is no exam, there's no chapters, there's no textbooks. It is work, there is real work, real audiences, and there is immediate feedback. There is continuous feedback also. There's no feedback at the end of March or May, but there is feedback as we work in it. So the idea of all experiential learning curriculum is to stimulate real life into a classroom.
Great. Thank you so much. I like what you said. So it's more both the curriculum and the delivery method kind of tie in very beautifully when it comes to international curriculum delivered through an experiential methodology. It's realistic, it's alive, it's skill-based, and it gets the children to actually start asking questions and getting involved rather than sitting back and learning. Thank you so much for that. Mrs. Narang, so all this is well and good, and we all understand there are merits attached to the international curriculum, but at the end of the day, when our parent has to decide, cost becomes a major differentiator when it comes to choosing between a national and an international curriculum. Now, help our parents understand why this differential in cost. Is it, we haven't reached economies of scale, very few children opt for it, big, the classroom, obviously there's a cost of running the class, the teachers are more expensive. So what is actually attributing to this cost? And do you think that this cost is likely to go up or go down in the future?
No, a lot of the cost is the frills and the infrastructure that you're paying for, the comfort that you want. The Delhi government has just signed an MOU with IB, and they are not going to be charging the kind of fees that the private schools are charging. But it is what you want. It's the kind of environment that you want to work in. I remember a child when I was working in a school which was not air conditioned, and this child is used to air conditioning at home, in the car, everywhere he goes, and he would, every afternoon when they had to go to rest, he would come and say, "Aapke school mein AC nahi hota hai?" That is what we have. Our children are used to a certain level of comfort. There are schools, IB schools all over the world, which are not providing these kinds of environments. So a part of the cost is the infrastructure cost. But having said that, some of the cost is because the way these programs are structured, they have a very stringent quality control. Right from the time of when you want to become a part of the international curriculum, you have the pre-authorization process, you have the authorization process through which, you are guided by experts. Especially if you are new to the position, then they supervise you through the implementation stage. Then they come and they train your teachers, you send your teachers for training, and training happens at all levels. It happens at the management level, it happens at the principal level, it happens at the supervisor, academic supervisors, and staff level, general staff level. And then thereafter, from time to time, they review your work. It's mandatory. So a certain amount of teacher training is mandatory. On top of that, schools, for example, in India, they need to put in a lot of training themselves to gear their children, their teachers up to the expectations of the international curriculum. Because our teacher training programs, even the most advanced ones, do not measure up to the requirements of international curriculum. And so a lot of that cost comes because if you want that kind of quality, then that quality has to be created and it has to be paid for.
Absolutely agree. So what I hear you say is we're paying for essentially the infrastructure, the training, and the quality control. And I quite like the fact that you mentioned the quality control. I think one of the reasons that the new education policy is so popular is because it's come in too late. So this is something that should be a regular part of every curriculum, where you're looking at the curriculum, revising it, changing it, and making sure that change becomes an inherent part. And that is something that happens very, very effectively in the international curriculum. So thank you so much for that.
Pooja,
Jyothis,
can I
very
just
quickly.
add to Mrs.
Yes.
Narang's point on this cost is very important because parents often think like this. You know, 50 years back, when our parents were in school, right, or the previous generation of parents, they largely went to government schools. Right. When we studied, when I went to school, for example, and many of us like yourself went to school, our parents made a choice to shift from a free public school to a private school. You probably went to a Loreto convent or a convent school or a DAV or a DPS, but these are all still private schools. Parents still had to pay some fees for it. So there's a transition that generation took from a free education to some fees, however small that be, but a still big amount in those. Like my DAV school, all through the year, they used to charge about 300 rupees per month, but it's still big money for my middle class upbringing. And I'm sure that's what all our families went through, right? So we saw the transition from public schools to private schools. Now what's happening is that there is a transition between private schools to private international schools. Because now there is an increased income, there is access to what's happening globally. We also are very aware, parents are also very aware that our children are not going to compete or collaborate with just children in Delhi or Bombay. They're going to collaborate and compete with children in Shanghai and Singapore and Boston, right? So for parents who are thinking about the cost benefit, our parents didn't think. They said we're going to give the best of what the country has to offer. And most middle class parents, in spite of the very poor education themselves, made that leap of faith in it. And when parents come and ask me now, they'll be probably, in a multinational corporation, great, socioeconomic standing as against their parents. Yet they say, oh, I just want to continue what I did. Then that is not evolution of parenting. That's in some sense a stagnation of parenting.
Absolutely. So what I hear you say, it's more. What I hear you say, it's more the need of the hour. And parents who do, can afford it, absolutely do look at that option, because what you're getting is worth the spend that you're doing. One key reason that why do you think that international curriculum is gaining so much popularity?
See, precisely, the world has shrunk to a very small unit, right? And our parents, they just keep moving between countries and continents. And there is all the more a need for a pan-global curriculum for students to seamlessly transition, despite the changes in the geographical locations, which is a delight to parents. So I believe that is one reason. And as my co-panelists mentioned earlier, it's a curriculum that focuses on application-based learning and assessments. So it's concept-oriented. It focuses on the well-rounded development of children, unlike the national curricula. And learning is more on a self-exploratory tangent, taking into consideration the learner's strengths, working closely with each child on their areas of improvement, enhancing their strengths. And teaching and learning is more at the child's pace than at a rush to finish the syllabus. And also, it's always better to start early and get exposed to the international curriculum, because as they go up the grades, as they climb the ladder, international curriculum offers a diverse set of subjects to choose from. So their learning is not just restricted to core science, commerce, and humanities subject. They'll have a lot of subjects to choose from according to their area of interest. So I believe universities also give a lot of preference to international curriculums like Cambridge and IB.
Right.
So all these are the factors that actually helps to popularize the international curriculum in India, or the shift is very much evident because of all these factors.
Great, thank you so much. So what I hear you say is better curriculum, better assessment, and obviously, the child is at the center of everything that is done in the international curriculum. Vishnu, if I could come to you now, what is that one key factor that sticks with you when it comes to the international curriculum?
I think it's really ready for the future. I teach economics in CBSE. I teach economics in international school. I've been head of a CBSE school and I moved to international, like pretty much like what this Narang has done in that sense. I'm simply amazed by how future ready and how deep the curriculum is in international school. In fact, Jyoti shared also the reasons of why people are choosing international. I just want to add to one more point. I think parents are also choosing international, making it the fastest growing curriculum in the world. In fact, it is the fastest growing curriculum in India, and not just India, around the world as well. Is that because I think parents are also getting increasingly disillusioned with the national curriculum and what has to offer, especially in the last 18 months. In fact, we look at during COVID, the kind of flip-flop, the kind of inauthentic assessment which has come out of the national curriculums, the way the formula has been arrived at, that is fairly disheartening for many parents, that they know that it doesn't reflect the true learning levels of their students. In some sense, it has been a race to the top, that every child gets a 95, 98, and everybody knows that a child getting a 95 as against a child getting 90, there's not much of a difference in it. So there's an increasing disillusion to the assessment. There is also increasing realization that in spite of NEP, in spite of CBSE's fantastic intent, it's also very difficult to implement some of these things in a large and a diversified country like India. Remember, CBSE's primary mandate is to be the national curriculum for the country, which means that they not just have to keep in mind a child in a school in Gurgaon or in Delhi, but also a child in Pantnagar or in Aruppukkottai in South, or in a remote village in Bihar. So they have to keep every child, every context in mind, and they have no choice but to, in some sense, average out the curriculum so that everybody is accessible to that curriculum. So what happens is that while it provides access to children in different parts of the country, children who are in cities like Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, or Gurgaon, they find it that it is not catching up to their standards. So there is need for a certain differentiation for families and children who are ahead of the curve in terms of their learning. They will make the choice of a more competitive, more rigorous, and more meaningful curriculum at all. So my response is why there is an increased acceptance of international is largely also the recognition of the limitations of a large national curriculum body like the CBSE or ICSE.
Great, thank you. Beautifully summed up, and I've never heard anyone say that before. But I 100% agree now that I hear you say it. So it's one curriculum that is actually supposed to live up to the expectation of a child who is going to a school, a small setup school in a small town, vis-a-vis a child who comes from a progressive family, goes to a school in a very, very large a metro. So it obviously has a lot of burden. But because of the failure for CBSE to be able to do that, we've kind of been edged and pushed towards the international curriculum that caters to that need of the children who require that advancement or that progression in the curriculum. Great, thank you so
Pooja,
much.
I just want to clarify, I don't want to put CBSE down. That's not the intent. I'm sure Ms. Narang would also agree. Even if any one of us are in CBSE, we have no other choice because of the diversity and the economic diversity and social diversity this country has. And this is just not in India. You look at China, for example. Absolutely. China is a great example, which has a very strong public schooling system, in fact, much stronger than India. Yet even there, families, middle class, upper middle class families are increasingly choosing the IB or international or Cambridge, even more importantly, purely because they feel that the public schooling system or the national curriculum caters to everybody in China as against the kids who are ahead of the curve. So there's also a shift, even in large countries outside India, also a shift towards international curriculums.
Absolutely. Needless to say, I think, yes, Mr. Narang.
Yeah, I must add over here that there are a few schools, CBSE schools and national curriculum, other schools, who understand where the gap is. And they have taken the onus upon themselves to bridge that gap within the framework of this national curriculum. And some of these schools are doing a very, very good job. I must acknowledge that. Yeah. But there are very few. There are very few.
Yes.
Sure. And for you, Mrs. Narang, what is that one key factor that stands out for you, where you think the international curriculum has got that edge over national curriculum?
I agree with everything that Vishnu has said. But if you look at the tertiary education in our country, the growth in primary and secondary schools has been far greater than in tertiary schools. And the assessment, the national assessment, gives you unrealistic scores. 99%, 100%, 98.7%. इतनी बारीकी से कहाँ पर आप assess कर सकते हो? And so a large spectrum of our children who are perfectly capable for higher education do not fail to make the cutoffs. And therefore, they have to look elsewhere for quality education, for quality tertiary education. And so overseas institutions where the whole socio-economic infrastructure and situation is different, where not everybody goes in for, a very small number goes in for tertiary education, yet they have these fabulous resources. So they are wooing children from India to come to them. And so there are scholarships, there are bank loans, and a whole lot of other things. So the children who want quality education and they cannot get it in their own country, they look outside. That is another very important reason. Again, I must qualify my statement by saying that in the last 5, 7, 8, 10 years, I have seen a lot of very good colleges and universities coming up in India. They match, and in fact, they are better than the best in the world. But they are just not enough to meet the demand of our children, of our country.
Right. Thank you so much. So what I hear you say is that assessment seems to be one reason why you think international curriculum stands beyond or above the national curriculum. Thank you so much, all four of you. I think what you've done today, is beautifully try to lay out the differences between the curriculum. And I'm going to go back to what Vishnu said. I understand. It's needless to say that each one of us here, probably all of us here, have studied a national curriculum. So there is a lot of respect in our heart for the national curriculum. But why look away and shy away if there is something that's better and that is out there for our children? So choosing the right curriculum is definitely critical for our children. And the curriculum essentially provides a good structure for the educator to successfully deliver this content, the content that is there. So make sure next time you, as a parent, are thinking of choosing a curriculum, you give the curriculum a good think and try and weigh out the pros and cons before you actually jump into it. And if you have the pocket, please do give the international curriculum a serious consideration. On that note, I'd like to thank all three of you. Thank you so much for taking our time, talking to us and telling us your views on the international curriculum. Thank you, Vishnu. Thank you, Paramjit ji. And thank you so much, Jyothis, for sharing your inputs with us. I hope parents who are watching this video find this discussion useful and are able to go ahead and make better choices for their children. On that note, adios, everyone, until we see you again. Till then, be safe, be informed, and be SchoolWiser. Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you.